actually. All right. I think we'll go ahead and get started. So before we launch into the webinar proper, I just need to carry out a couple of quick admin tasks. So just want to make sure you can all hear me. If you can hear me, could you type yes in the chat box? Awesome. So you're all on mute right now, just so we can avoid any background noise. There will be a point later on in the conversation when you can all join in. At that point, I can let you unmute yourselves and ask any questions you might have. In the meantime, if you think of a question, please feel free to type it in the chat box, and I'll read it out for Helena to answer in the Q&A portion. And just a quick note that if you want to make sure that everyone can see your message, you have to make sure you're sending to all panelists and attendees. So I know that some of you might not be able to stay for the full hour and a half, so I just wanted to share with you what we would encourage you to do next after this webinar, which is to join the International Alliance for Localization, or the IAL. This is a project that Helena's organization, Local Futures, has set up with about 900 members in 58 different countries, and it's a cross-cultural network of thinkers, activists, and essentially anyone who's interested in localizing and wanting to connect with others doing so around the world. And it's a great place to carry on the conversation after this webinar is over. So you can sign up on Local Futures website. If you go to the top menu under our projects, there should be a link to it there. I can also add a link in the chat box for all of you. You'll then, once you join the IAL, gain access to the IAL Facebook group and email listserv, where you can talk with people from all over the world who are working on rebuilding local economies and revitalizing communities. We've actually just launched a video project called Voices from the IAL, where we're trying to create a compilation of 2-minute videos from IAL members discussing the importance of localization and what local means to them. So it would be great if you could join the IAL and just record a simple 2-minute video of yourself explaining what local means to you. And so we can add that to our project. So I'll hand things over to Helena now to explore how you all can be part of the transition towards a future that places human and ecological well-being front and center, both right now during the coronavirus pandemic and also afterward. So Helena, I wonder if you could start by just talking a little bit about a term that you often use, which is big picture activism. So what is that, and why is it so important right now?
Yeah, we have discovered over the years that people are simply not getting enough information about what's actually going on in the world. We've been working ourselves, as some of you know, in remote parts of the world, particularly in Ladakh or West Tibet, also in Bhutan, and we've ended up very involved in Korea, Japan. And what we found is that when you really know what's going on at the grassroots around the world, you will feel so much more positive about human nature and about the potential for a positive future. But sadly, in the mainstream media, even mainstream academia, mainstream science, most avenues of knowledge have been dominated essentially by the very powerful, the top-down view of the world. You know, usually backed by lots of money, the media conglomerates, but even universities now have become very commercialized. So the actual truth about what people are demonstrating around the world that they want, that they need, that they thrive on, that evidence is something that we need to look for. We need to become big picture activists in the sense that we wake up to the fact that we have to go beyond those dominant channels to look for information about what's actually going on, and the evidence that would point us not only in a direction of human thriving, but inevitably natural, ecological, the living earth thriving. Now, there is a path in that direction, one where both human beings and the plants, the animals, the soil, the water we depend on can thrive. And that's a path that we call localization. There could be other words and maybe better words, but we still haven't found anything that encompasses this very profound need to reconnect more deeply to one another, into more interdependent human scale structures, and more deeply connect to the living earth on which we depend. Everything we need, every single thing comes from the earth. But we have been, for many generations now, on a path that has taken us further and further from nature, and I would argue, further and further from our human nature, from our inner deep selves. So I have felt incredibly encouraged, particularly in the last 10 years, by a reawakening to this truth that what we need is very different from what this dominant path of progress, of development, of growth has been offering us. So we see a very clear fork in the road now. I hope many of you are having an opportunity to pause a bit and to rethink some basic assumptions, to really question, where do we want to go when we come away from this lockdown, when we are more free to gather, and we're more free to start collaborating for a better future? Which way do we want to go? We see a very, very clear fork in the road. One of them is a continuation of essentially an economic path. It's a techno-economic path that's been taking us really for about 500 years in a direction of dependence on remote parts of the world. We became essentially victims, not of some tiny group of conspirators, but we became victims of a system that did start with force. It started with slavery, it started with colonialism, and actually preceding that, Christianity in the Inquisition and so on, by burning millions of women at the stake, were part of the build-up to a system that repressed the feminine, repressed the deep feminine knowledge about life, about the living earth, about that deep connection to what is our home, our spiritual and our physical home, and our economic source. It's the economy, the living earth. So we really can't afford to continue down a path which started in slavery and force, but in the modern era, particularly after the Second World War, it looked as though infinite amount of fossil fuels were able to keep this path going, and we were pushed off the land with huge machinery, lots of fossil fuels, into high-rise cities, also based on lots of fossil fuels, sitting in high-rise apartments. And in my native country of Sweden, this path was developed fairly justly. It was very much wedded to a socialist distribution of some of the wealth that was created in that way. But it was still fundamentally an anti-spiritual, anti-ecological, and ultimately anti-democratic path. So what we found, even in the heyday of Sweden's success as a modern industrial state, there was epidemics of depression, anxiety, alcoholism, and people, in Stockholm, I discovered in the mid 70s that by that time, in every dwelling, more than half of those dwellings, there was one person living alone. And having worked in Ladakh and Bhutan and having experienced the amazing wealth that comes from having a much larger connected web of relationships as you're growing up, as a mother, having about 10 live-in caretakers for every child, the ease with which every child was so cared for and so seen and acknowledged and made to feel part of a human connected web of relationships, that so clearly created a much deeper sense of self-esteem, a much deeper sense of security, of psychological security. So as I came back to Sweden, having lived in Ladakh and Bhutan and discovered how much suffering there was, I became an advocate for this other path that was about coming back to more reconnected community. We can't suddenly reconstitute the extended family, but we can much more consciously reach out to connect with others. And I believe that in the long run, we will be making our way back to what is so clearly a healthier way to build a sense of self. We're really talking about the localizing path, reconstituting our humanity. As we've gone down a path that took us so far from nature and so far from each other, that path was built on a sense of fear, a sense of scarcity, and the scarcity was particularly, again, the economic trajectory, where suddenly in the city we're all dependent on money. We don't know if tomorrow the price of bread will be twice as much. So it creates a neurotic need to try to hold on to that money. At the same time, in that urban competitive path, we are forced to fight for scarce jobs. Now, it may sound very simplistic and it may sound to you as, this is something we can't change. But I want to assure you that every single moment of the day, things are changing. Change is inevitable. So we now really need to wake up to which direction of change we want to go in. And we are seeing that there are two developments going on, two opposing directions. There is one techno-economic path which is continuing down a trajectory which leads to more and more urbanization, which leads to more and more destruction of millions of jobs, smaller businesses, smaller farmers, even the destruction. And we're talking about, at a rapid pace, destroying villages, towns, even cities that are no longer part of a future that is based on allowing finance and technology to be where the money is made. The money is actually now made through a blind, algorithmic robots. Robots are essentially creating the money, and they're creating it out of thin air. We're allowing a make-believe wealth to take us down a path that all the evidence, when you look closer to the ground, the path where we don't want to go. We don't want to be more fragmented. We don't want to be more competitive. And above all, we don't want to be more caught up in speed, where we can barely breathe, where we can barely have time to look after ourselves, never mind our children, our parents, our gardens. The time pressure and the time poverty are an inevitable consequence of a techno-economic globalizing path. All the time this system has separated us further and further from the sources of our food, from the people who are making our clothing, from the people who grow, every aspect, separation, distance across the globe. The benefit, if you call it benefit, the wealth accumulation has gone to fewer and fewer people. So it's an extractive system that is creating these billionaires and bordering now on trillionaires and these quadrillions of dollars that are circulating to support giant monopolies. So there's a lot to say, and I want to have a discussion, so I won't go on too long, but I do just want to urge you to take an interest in examining the difference between these two paths and understanding that in order to do so, we have to actually step back and look at the bigger picture of what's been going on globally. Understand better that there's a global system that is pushing countries, governments, and societies and the natural world in a direction that is really disastrous. We have all the evidence we would need to see the ecocide, the climate change, the gap between rich and poor in every single country just rising obscenely. Most people do not like this. Most people are aware of it, but most people are not aware of the dynamic, the structure, the actual thread that has taken society in that direction. And that has been primarily through free trade treaties. Free trade sounds like a good thing, but free trade has meant giving more freedom to global banks and corporations to essentially do what they need to do to accumulate more wealth for themselves. This dynamic is not the consequence of some nasty, some small number of nasty people sitting in dark rooms, smoking big fat cigars and trying to destroy the world. But it's the consequence of a type of structural conspiracy where over-specialization linked to large-scale economic structures that very few people are actually stepping back to look at. And that conspiratorial structure leads to things like a high-level expert in England a few weeks ago, someone named Tim Lernig. He reports to the Treasury, highly respected expert, comes out with a report to say, well, agriculture only contributes 1% to GDP. So let's stop farming. This is ridiculous. Why should we farm? Let's be like Singapore and import our food. Singapore is doing quite well. Well, Britain should do the same thing. Now, this is a type of madness that has been occurring progressively as the very male-dominated, what you could call patriarchal system, has continued to take us in a direction towards this large-scale speed and removal from the realities on which we depend. We, all of you who are listening, I hope, will become big picture activists to point out that we have so many signs, even in mainstream culture. We are moving away from a culture that, a few generations ago, quite happily proclaimed that white Western people were supremely superior to the rest of the people of this earth. It's not that long ago that native people were even hunted as animals. We have moved as a culture very, very rapidly, particularly in the last 20 years or so, towards a respect for other cultures, towards a respect for the feminine, towards a love of animals. We have people, as we know, who are passionate about their rights. We have very clear signs that the human race is waking up to the need to nurture and to really respect that more feminine, nurturing, more holistic way of being. And it's a connected way of being. It's one where we experience the spiritual truth that all spiritual traditions have taught us, that all life is interconnected. It's a web of interconnection. We are the air we breathe. We are the water we drink. We are life, a big, wonderful dance of life that even if we don't like some rats or cockroaches or snakes, we have discovered that we cannot just destroy one species and think that we are in control. That discovery is also widespread now. So we have actually a deep learning that's been going on, but I would argue that that learning has not translated into being willing to take on the techno-economic juggernaut that right now is set to push us away from doing any food growing, push us into allowing robots to do that work with a lot of propaganda, saying that people don't want to farm, it's very miserable work, with the propaganda that robots are actually kinder and more wise than we are. There's been a very heavy-handed demonization of human beings and human nature, literally arguing, as I say, that robots will do a better job. And I'm afraid that even in the environmental movement, because of a lack of the big picture, people have ended up believing a dominant narrative that has been saying, what's wrong with these people? They have all the information about climate change, and yet people are not changing. They're selfish, they don't want to change. They don't want to give up their lifestyle. So here we are, emissions are going up, and yet we're seeing the very dramatic evidence of climate change. What's going on here? Well, from our experience across the world, what's going on is that we have not been given the information. We've not been given the big picture that showed us that just about the time that the world woke up to climate change, at that time we had a major shift towards even more rapid globalization. In fact, that's when the name was given in the 80s. And by the early 90s, this process of globalization was in full swing. Trade treaties that gave giant businesses the freedom through free trade to go around the world, search for the cheapest labor. So that meant they went to the poor countries of the world to do the production, taking factories from the industrialized world and often producing even a t-shirt, cotton grown in one country, combed in another, processed further in another, and then the text printed in China. So this was going on a massive scale. Routinely, governments ended up importing and exporting the same food. Supermarkets flying apples across the world to be washed, flying them back again, fish to be processed in China, flying back again, across the world. Larger and larger quantities. Insane trade is what we call it. Now, most people were not informed about the industrial change that drove up CO2 emissions massively. All we heard about was these consumers. Why aren't they consuming properly? Why aren't they consuming less? Why are they still driving their cars? Now, actually, one of the reasons they were still driving their cars is because in the same period, in most places, public transport became more expensive, and in many countries also systems were shut down. So we really need to look at the big picture. It's not rocket science. There are certain basic principles, and there's a basic trajectory which has to do with what governments are subsidizing. First of all, what they're taxing and what they use those taxes to subsidize, and what they're regulating. So there is a clear trajectory on that global path. But I also, before I stop, I want to also let you know that there's a very clear trajectory where around the world, literally millions of people are engaged in local economic activity. In fact, billions, because there are many traditional people who are still more in touch with the community on which they depend and where they're interconnected with human scale businesses and enterprise and connected with the land on which they depend. Now, so that's billions. Now, in the modern industrial world, there are more and more people, and also in China and India, there are more and more people who are now beginning to localize, consciously to localize their economies. There is a proliferation of such inspiring local food initiatives that we have helped to pioneer in many countries. So we've been closely involved with the process where, in most cases, even now, it's often very difficult to start them. Even the farmers, small farmers who are verging, they're almost bankrupt and really struggling, but they're still resistant because they haven't had enough information about how magically a new farmers market or a new consumer-supported agriculture scheme can actually turn them around economically, and often in just a year or even less. So it really is quite a magical formula, and yet not enough people know about it, which is why we need big picture activism. So it includes not only understanding that major, big, sort of rather depressing path, but understanding and being informed simultaneously about this win-win-win magical solution where, when people start supporting their local farmers, and local, let me explain, can be what you might call regional. Even as a first step, it can be, let's buy potatoes from America in America rather than from Argentina. Or let's buy grapes from France in France rather than from Argentina. We have seen, the local economy destroyed by these artificially cheap imports that literally destroy the grape farmers in France, the garlic. We saw garlic from China invading the market, costing half the price of local food, all because of a heavily subsidized, manipulated economy. Despite that, people have been able to build local demonstrations. And local, as I say, can start off by, if you start a farmer's market, it could be, having some products from the country, from the region. It could be from hundreds of miles away, might be the only place you might get something that would be desirable in the local market. It's about a process of shortening distances. And it leads to not only, almost overnight, a stimulus for farmers to diversify, because they will do better if they diversify. And I want to alert you to the most wonderful film that shows you how quickly you can transform a dead soil that has been, subjected to monoculture, which has been the absolute imperative of this globalizing economy. Bigger and bigger monoculture, killing the soil, using subsidized water and still not being able to be productive. When you diversify, you increase productivity. And this is a truth that is the foundation of the new path towards nature, towards localization. Diversification is an absolutely key word, not regenerative agriculture. Diversified agriculture is key, and that leads to regenerating the soils. So regeneration is very important, but the key big picture understanding is that we need to diversify. You can take any 2 bits of land, a square meter or 100,000 hectares, and if you diversify, you'll be able to produce more every time. And in diversifying, you are creating conditions that create meaningful and enjoyable livelihoods. And this is being demonstrated throughout the world. I've seen it in China, I've seen it in Africa. It's an absolutely magical formula that as I say, creates more meaningful, enjoyable livelihoods. There's a new young farmers movement where people actually want to farm as part of this path. Now, it's still small. It's, of course, a small percentage still in terms of particularly in the industrialized world, but it's a very rapidly growing curve, and it's so inspiring. And I wanted to tell you about the film, The Biggest Little Farm. Be sure to look at that. A new film from California showing you the thriving, just rich change that happened by taking monoculture and diversifying. And yeah, it needs to be bookended with that very clear message that this is the way to increase productivity while reducing the ecological footprint, while creating more meaningful livelihoods. On a crowded planet, how can we justify replacing people with energy and technology which uses scarce minerals when population, human population, is a bit too high? We are definitely living on an overcrowded planet. But it's so wonderful to realize that in competing with blind, stupid machine driven by lots of energy, human beings, every step of the way, are needed now to regenerate, to renew, to look after every seedling, every animal, every plant. And I'd like to say also every child, because we have impoverished the number of people who are able to look after our children. When we segregate them into separate age groups and have one person with 50 children or teenagers, we are creating a factory farming of our children. When you have intergenerational and intergenerational groups, you get natural collaboration. In the segregation, you get natural competition. So we need more people in education, in healthcare, in food, building. We need, for all our basic needs, for all our real needs, we need more people, not more technology. I just also want to finish by saying that when it comes to this sort of reconstitution of who we are as human beings, one area to look at to get the insight that we are talking about is to look at what therapies work. When people are broken, when they are addicted to drugs, to alcohol, when they are deeply anxious, depressed, the therapies that work are community-based. They help people to start on a journey of connected change, of sharing, and deeply sharing that change. Going at it alone is absolutely what we've been trained to do inside the dominant narrative, the dominant story. The localization path is about changing the I to a we. Alcoholics Anonymous has already shown that fundamental connection also to a spiritual truth. Oh, the truth of interconnection, the truth of oneness. So the spiritual message of oneness is about community, is about connecting also to nature. And that's why the most effective therapies I know about are where you combine the community building and the connection to nature. And they're just wonderful, inspiring projects that take juvenile delinquents or prisoners or torture victims, refugees who have suffered horribly, into that space, aided by people who have the wisdom to understand the need for community and connection to nature. On a small scale too, around the world, you'll see in schools, even now, sometimes by bringing in a dog, one little fragment of life into a school is a benefit, into old people's homes. That connection to animals is profound and healing. We are talking about with localization, the structures, the economic part, the economic incentives that can allow us to live in that interconnected, interdependent way. It is the economics of happiness. So I really hope you'll join us in getting this message out. And now I hope we'll have a good discussion.
All
Thank
right.
you.
Thank you so much, Helena. So we're going to open the floor now to questions. I've already seen a lot of great ones come in the chat. I also want to say that if you'd like to ask your question out loud, please go ahead and use the raise hand function, which I think should be in the bottom center of your screen. And I'll call on you in between reading out some of the written questions that we got. So I'll start with this one. It's possibly quite an expansive question, but this is from Mark, how might we leverage this unique moment during and or post-pandemic to move our communities toward economic localization?
Well, this is I absolutely what I'm hoping will happen is that people, while in lockdown, having a bit of time to rethink and to really look at where do we want to head. A lot of people are talking about this. What is the world going to look like after the pandemic and which way do we want to go? So I hope that people will now join a group. Ideally, we're always trying to encourage that you change the I to a we. And we generally like to lead people with 5 words about what this entails. And number one, the first word is connect, educate, resist, renew, and celebrate. Now, connect means please don't go at this alone. So even in lockdown, connect over the web with a few like-minded people. They may be colleagues, friends, whatever, with the question, what world do we want? What do we want to leave for our children? And the question also that we're offering you is, there is a path forward that is healing for people and planet. And what does that look like? So I'm hoping that you together will be exploring that. We have lots of readings, blogs, films listed on our website that are a very good beginning. We're linked to other organizations. So I hope you'll explore our website, localfutures.org, to do that learning. And very often, people are still very short of time. So everyone wouldn't necessarily look at the same film or read the same article or the same book, but then come back to share and discuss and get ready after lockdown to come together to start the action. But right now is the time to be sure that you're not subconsciously supporting the dominant path, because there's a lot of idealism also going into thinking that electronic money could be a great localizer, could help to decentralize. No, if you study what's happening with the internet, if you see in other parts of the world how easily it can be shut down, let's not put all our eggs in that basket, especially not economically. We need to rebuild the more face-to-face connections. So I hope that helps a bit.
Awesome, thank you. I'll read Mishka's question next. Everything sounds great, and I agree with everything you say about the need for localization and small-scale communities and human connection to nature, but how will these grassroots movements overcome the resistance of corporations and governments that are part of the more globalized system?
Yeah, well, this again, I'm absolutely convinced that if we can help to get the big picture out, we have a remarkable number of people still, even though the truth is, which I didn't mention before, that most people have been getting poorer with growth. People are actually being made to work faster and harder just to pay for their food. Food has not become cheaper, but we're told it has, but this is part of the dominant narrative. When you look at how many hours we have to work to put the food on the table, how many hours we have to work to pay for our rent or our mortgage, we are becoming poorer. We're working harder and longer. There have been economists writing about this. A friend of mine in America who was at Harvard, a friend in England, both wrote books showing very clearly how we're becoming poorer. So I am absolutely convinced that if all the people who, despite that pressure, despite the poverty, are engaged in helping in some way to make the world a better place. They may just be donating to an animal charity. They may be helping to buy a new something for their school. They may be doing everything they can to raise awareness about climate change, but usually in a very limited way. They may be doing, helping people in an old age home. All of that activity trying to make the world a better place, including voluntary time and money. We want to reach those people with a clarity that whatever it is they care about, it has either been created by the dominant trajectory or it's being exacerbated by it. And if that's not true, but we can show you that almost all the crises we face are linked in that way. But even if there are some few that aren't, we can show that there will not be the money to deal with that issue, with that problem. So we all have an interest in coming together, not to create one interlinked giant organization, but one collective voice, a chorus of voices that will absolutely not allow our governments to take their orders from money that make a joke of democracy. Governments are actually signing in black and white that we won't do anything to reduce your profit to multinational companies. That's what's happening in the trade treaty. It makes a total joke of democracy. And what's happening is people are voting. And in that period, people who want to be elected will say, yeah, we care about your jobs. And we're going to be really looking after the climate and health and everything you care about. And the minute they're in power, suddenly they seem to be listening to some other votes. Well, it's the votes of big money, and it's big money from the global economy that has to be taken back. Localization is about placing every business, every bank inside a democratic arena where democracy determines what happens to business. Business doesn't shape culture, doesn't impose a consumer culture on our children before they can speak even. No, we bring the economy home to democracy, to democratic process. I believe that message is one that could lead to a massive movement that could transform politics. And in fact, for me, it's all about how do we get the message out? Because our media are colonized, even the social media are colonized. So we have to work hard at it. And this is why after lockdown, we really encourage people to organize festivals, to come together with this discussion. And I mentioned before that those 5 words, celebrate, a very important part of this process of also building the local initiatives that demonstrate the health and the joy that come from reconnecting to nature and community. And so when you bring into that participatory song, music, and dance, you are revitalizing culture in a way that becomes very, very seductive. So part of this raising awareness is also to highlight those very real small projects that are demonstrating these. And we're talking also about whole little towns around the world that are beginning to demonstrate in a collective way what happens when you start to localize. So I really feel the issue is the bigger message, going beyond the single issues, but showing that the single issues are connected to that bigger part. If we just stick to, for instance, climate, we are losing so many people who are so desperately worried about their livelihoods that they become fearful and manipulated by demagogues at the top who blame the left, who blame the environmentalists, and who say, we're going to grow the economy for you, we're growing it, we're giving now, billions of bailouts to the cruise line industry, and that's going to help your economy. Well, they fall for this demagoguery. We need that systemic economic analysis to bring us together. It will benefit, as I said, the environment and jobs. So let's put that message out and build up the numbers very rapidly.
All right, thank you. I'd like to bring in some of the people who have their hands raised. So I'm going to unmute a couple of you and let you ask your questions out loud. So I'll start with Mohammed. You might still have to unmute yourself, or just double check that you're unmuted.
I'd love to know where Mohammed is. Probably not.
If you're looking for the way to unmute yourself, it might be in the bottom left corner, a microphone button.
So I think that now I'm unmuted.
Yes,
am I right?
We can hear you.
Okay, so I'm from Iran, West Asia.
Are you in Iran now, or are you living somewhere else?
Yeah, sure. So I'm living in Iran, yeah.
Nice to hear from you.
Okay, thank you. Me too. So the question is, the very idea of localization is very, tempting to me, and I think that so I'm thinking about to, as you said, raise awareness and try to, follow the project here. But the question is, so where should we start, this project? Don't you think that, the very heart of capitalism in New York, in London, in Shanghai, these, hugely populated, places in the world with, massive, capitalist infrastructure should be, the target of this project first, and then we move to the, some underprivileged countries and regions in the world. So I think that, how can we just withstand this huge capitalist mainstream? I mean, from, the economic aspect of it, and also the, the media facet.
Yeah, well, again, what I was saying was that it is absolutely the big task is how can we withstand the pressure from the dominant narrative being pushed on us that divides us, too much politics of identity, so that we really want to see women strengthened. We want to see, a lot of the issues that are being brought up, indigenous people's rights and so on. But we have to be so careful that we don't end up supporting a divisive agenda. But it's the bigger picture, it's the systemic shift that would be beneficial right now in Iran as much as it would be in Shanghai. And actually in Shanghai, there's a very wealthy guy who's supporting eco-villages. And in China, there's a movement called the Rural Reconstruction Movement that we're connected to as well. So there are these little seeds happening everywhere. And what's wonderful too is that you can see that the big cities, as part of the dominant path, are set to grow and grow and grow. But you can see that as part of the localization movement, people are choosing to move to smaller cities. And as I said, even people who love farming. So I'm hoping in Iran, I'm almost certain, if you look around, you will see there are already the seeds of this more community-based, human-scale way of doing things. And I think starting as a project almost everywhere, there is such a great need to focus on this shift in food and farming. People, they need to remind themselves that when we're talking about the economy, the only thing humans produce that every human being needs every day of the year is food. In our evolution, we were, most of us, involved with that process of gathering, growing, processing. I'm not saying that in the modern world that we need to go back to having 100% involved in food, but we certainly need to be looking at changing the numbers, which in most industrialized countries, is now 2% or something of the population involved in farming. Now, and also we've got to remember that we're dealing with the madness of the economic leadership believing that farming is completely unimportant when it's the only thing that every person needs every day of the year. And they are part of constituting a path or, reinforcing a path where we are separated further and further from the food we need every day. And then we talk about climate change. And then there are lots of think tanks putting out the message that, oh, don't believe that the global food economy is producing more CO2 emissions than local food economies. There's a lot of, so we are up against a lot of propaganda. We have to learn to think for ourselves, have to come back to basics. I hope in Iran you will support as a priority more food security, diversifying, strengthening, and of course using some technology that actually really suits agriculture and other production, but in the hands of human scale institutions and relationships. I think it's all about informing ourselves and others and doing everything we can to get the word out. That's really what it's about. So in a way, find that also hopeful, that, a vision, a systemic idea could travel very quickly, even with our limitations. That's the big obstacle. What's between our ears, what's in our heads, the narrative that we end up supporting. And part of that narrative is that system is too big, we can't change it. And what can we do about it? We can do a lot about it by exposing it for what it is. But that means stepping back to really look at the contours of it. We don't have to understand hedge funds. I don't understand a hedge fund. In fact, I've spoken to people in big banks who knew that even the heads of those banks didn't know what the young guys were doing when they were playing around to create this terrible casino playing with our lives. So we don't have to understand the details, but we need to understand the need for genuine democracy, genuine visibility, accountability, and getting back to human scale, human pace. Global collaboration, essential. And global collaboration can happen from the foundation of informed movements and people. We need to be at the table to see what sort of treaties make sense in terms of climate change, what sort of trade treaties make sense. There's too much to say, but read my book, Local is Our Future. I should have mentioned that earlier.
Okay. Thank you very much for your answer.
I'll put a link in the chat in a minute to Helena's book where you can all find it on our website.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Mohammed. I'm gonna bring in Chandra and Jonathan. I'll try and unmute you both, and we'll.
And I'd love to know where you are.
Yes, it would be great if you could say where you're based right now. Chandra, I guess we'll start with you if you're ready to ask your question.
Thank you. Namaste.
Namaste.
I'm from Delhi.
In Delhi, yeah.
Delhi, National Capital Region, yeah. So about 20 kilometers. So far, I'll straight away come to the question. We've been soft pedaling the illegitimacy of sovereign nation states. My
no, sorry, I couldn't quite hear what you said. Can you say that again? I heard you say sovereign nation states.
Yeah. So the illegitimacy, for example, Mother Earth is sovereign. We are all born on Earth as a whole.
Yeah.
But from our birth, we are handed down a constitution and a set of laws that breathe on our necks all our lives. So I think, so my question is, do you think the time has come to question the sovereignty of nation states and then put forward my solution?
Yeah.
Which is that.
Yes, I do. I do, but again and again, this is a little bit, it's a little complex, but but not very once you have this sort of clarity. Absolutely. The nation state was forged as a consequence of this dominant economic power. And you can see it particularly clearly in terms of the colonial expansion and forging nation states that were completely artificially bringing groups together that had naturally been living a more bioregional, community-based way of life. So the nation state was forged by this economic, very destructive economic trajectory, also in the Western world. However, where we are today, I would argue that we would be unwise to try to break off into smaller and smaller groups before we deal with the real political power, which is a centralized global economic structure, which, by the way, creates as many billionaires in India and China as it does, in fact, more than in the Western world. So the problem is that globalized structure. And while we have that, I think breaking into smaller units would be unwise. However, so we need the nation state. We need to operate with a building protection from the nation state level through international collaboration. So remember, we're collaborating internationally to deal with this algorithm creating fake money and the Monsantos and the Coca-Colas of this world that are now basically running the world. At the same time, we can be clear about the need to give much more power to the region, to the local areas. And there is a whole fabric of regulations that are being used to suppress and disenable and disempower local production, particularly around food. And what we are told is being brought in the name of public health and safety is actually often well-intentioned people, but they don't realize that as they bring in those regulations to local small restaurants and farmers, they're helping to destroy them and to allow the McDonald's to come in completely without those regulations, or even if they conform to them at the local level, they have that enormous wealth of money behind them. They can pay for all kinds of silly things that are actually not about public health. So it's a little bit complex. So we can simultaneously bring more power to the local and regional level while using the nation state as a vehicle, as part of an international agenda that would be about new agreements between nation states to finally bring back a semblance of democracy. I hope that makes sense.
I've been working on it for past 2 decades.
Can you say that again?
Yeah, I've been working on this for about 20 years. So I'll just share some of my experiences. When British Empire gave transfer of power to the Indian government, this is not a people's government. This is basically an imposed structure. So
Absolutely.
in that, lots of powers rest with the provincial, the governments, and not with the local authorities. See, this is tweaked in the constitution itself. So as a result, even if I want to localize and even grow some vegetables in the 20-acre land that is right in front of the apartment society that I stay in one of the neighborhoods of Delhi National Capital Region. So I have no access to it. Policies are micromanaged to the finest detail to disposes people from growing basic things like vegetables, ensuring that they have clean air, ensuring that there is proper water recharging, ensuring that there are zero to landfill waste management system. So all this, there is so much of intrusion of the deep state into the minute micromanaged functioning of a government like India. So my point is that can we talk about broadly? I'll just come
again, Parnika, really the answer is more holistic information. People do not, they just are not aware of this. And so in some cases, there are now places where local councillors who are meant to be imposing these regulations are turning a blind eye because they are realizing how destructive it is. We have to raise awareness. Thank you though for your input. It's very important.
Okay, so
Thank you. Do you mind if we go to the next question?
yeah, sure.
Andres?
Thank
Okay,
you.
thank you. Jonathan has been waiting to talk. Jonathan, do you want to ask your question now?
Yeah, sure. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, absolutely.
And where are
So
you?
I'm in Devon, England.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, I watched your film this evening. I was really, really inspired. Really loved it. One thing that really spoke to me was your appreciation of other cultures. And I wonder whether you think it's problematic that some environmentalists, rather than focusing on localization, put the focus on subtly converting other cultures to be like ours. For example, seeing places in the world that don't have electricity as, this is a big problem that we need to sort out. We need to give everyone the same education that we have in the West, and only when that happens will the world sort itself out. So have I got that right? Do you agree with that?
Yes, I do. It's a very tricky thing, and it's deeply, deeply problematic. And part of our work is to try to show that the spiritual wealth that still exists in more traditional parts of the world, of having that intergenerational community fabric, that even the homeless on the streets of Delhi are at least sleeping in community groups, intergenerational groups. And I'm not at all trying to romanticize that life, but I am saying that they have a wealth that the people sleeping on the street in the West don't. They're completely isolated. So they also have that knowledge of how to care for a bit of the natural world and gain some of their sustenance from it, even though so many of them have been marginalized and trampled on by colonialism and slavery. There's still a wealth there, so that it's not the first priority to try to bring, especially schooling and electric power to people. But it's a very tricky issue. I hope you read my book, Ancient Futures, and help to get the word out, because it is very sad how much good intention goes into that type of development. And also, paradoxically, our work in Ladakh and in Bhutan and with other people consists mainly of providing the truth of what's actually happening in the West. See, in school books in India, they're still saying we've got to do everything we can to educate these children and get these backward, literally backward, not stupid, but backward farmers into the city. So there's huge propaganda that tells people that in the city, through the media images and so on, you see this, it looks like you don't have to work, you push a few buttons, and they assume that we have all the wealth that they have in terms of the inner wealth. They don't realize how our neuroses and psychological problems are really, the majority of us have those. So there's a huge amount of information sharing both ways that needs to happen there too. So please help if you can. You might be interested in looking at a film a friend of ours made called Schooling the World, and help that to get that out as well. Thank you
very much. Thank you.
I was muted. Thank you, Jonathan. I'm gonna turn back to the questions that have come through in the chat. This one is from Anna Prato. She says, I feel that to really start to walk on the alternative path, we need to decolonialize education. The homeschool and unschool movements are growing, but do you have any insights on how to go about incorporating these ideas into the formal education system?
Well, again, in terms of incorporating it into the mainstream, there are some hopeful signs. Again, there are little seeds, and when you have our lenses on, you see them. For instance, we've been doing a lot in South Korea, and my book was a bestseller there, the Ancient Futures book. So I've been able to, deal with people at a higher level. And recently, the school superintendent of Seoul, committed 100% to not only bringing in local organic food into the schools, but also having children engaged in food production. So there are some of those changes also in Canada. I see some of this, we're saying, but anyway, there are examples like that. However, it's going to take a lot of work. And by the way, I have to say most of this work is happening through women waking up, whether it's interest in the food economy and getting things launched, whether it's changes to education, most of these fundamentally important bottom-up initiatives, it's women leading the way and doing the work. So we just have to keep working away, getting out the word, and education and even science. I mean, what's happened to knowledge, to subsume it under economic priorities, which, as we say, don't even recognize that food is the most important economic, product. So we have to be pretty clear now about questioning the dominant trajectory and coming out with holistic, grounded, and again, holistic is very, very important, because sometimes people who would be defending, for instance, in healthcare, if they take a narrow position and not look at that broader economic trajectory, it becomes very, very difficult to debate, for instance, around vaccines or no vaccines, or in schooling. Far too many people, I feel, focus just on the modality of teaching. In other words, let's do it in a more collaborative, friendly, and healthy way. But they don't look enough at the curriculum. They don't look enough at what are our children learning to do? What are they coming out trained as? So once you see localization as a genuine trajectory, then you have to start looking at a big change towards helping people become both much more holistic in terms of their knowledge, but also much more holistic in terms of their skills. It's a wonderful transformation towards moving away from being just this one thing. I've done, all these years of study, and now I'm this accountant, or I'm this eye specialist, or I'm a speech specialist, and that's who I am. The amazing thing that happens once we wake up to the need for more genuinely ecological and genuinely beneficial ways of living and doing things, we have the great joy of developing many skills and being much more rounded as human beings. So yeah, it's, I think, getting out another vision as widely as possible, and where possible trying to get it into the mainstream. But I guess right now, I think you'd probably be better off supporting or being part of a more alternative direction. We've had some feedback from friends who are trying to do homeschooling now, and they say, they're seeing the tedious and very often meaningless stuff that our children are being subjected to, and they're saying they think they'd be much better off just basically keeping them at home and not following the curriculum, because they could actually teach them to garden, they could teach them even some building skills, they could develop music skills again, and not with this idea of being specialists who show off, but actually part of more of a participatory way of doing things.
So the next question is from Arthur. He says, one of the many important positive aspects of localization to me is its psychological effects, namely the feeling of connectedness to other people and to nature. Could you talk more about your own personal transformation through your experience in Ladakh and other parts of the world? And how can we encourage society at large to begin engaging with local human and more than human communities?
Yeah, well, a lot to say there too, and it's getting a bit late, so I'll try to keep it brief, which is always difficult for me, but my transformation was entirely from Ladakh, and I'm always so amazed and so grateful that somehow other people have had a similar awakening without having had that quite unique experience. You know, Ladakh was, when I arrived there in the mid-70s, people were still living according to their own wisdom, their own principles, dependent on their own resources. They were still weaving their own clothes from their own wool. They were building their own houses. They were growing their own food. And by the way, because it was done as a we, you know, in a group, all of that work was so easy and so joyous, literally singing as they did it. It sounds almost unbelievable. And sometimes when I think back of the way it was, I wish I had been able to do more documentation, more filming, and I was told, anyway, this is another whole story. So I got to deeply experience, speaking the language fluently, this remarkable wealth. And as I said, in terms of the interactions, you know, seeing the 80-year-old uncle, you know, with the 1-year-old child walking together, and just, you know, both of them like so similar, both hairless, toothless, very slow at walking, very slow at eating. They were just made for each other. And they spent so much time together. And it was, it's just amazing joy and wealth and humor, and also an alertness. So I then, you know, I would go back to the West and see that we developed this idea of progress, which put all those people as primitive. And even as we rediscover our sort of love for the indigenous, and so we're still not aware of some of those deeper issues, and we're not aware of the structures of the daily life of indigenous people. What did that look like? It's not just pick out a few rituals and a few aspects. Let's really try to learn from what that looks like. And I'm saying now, you know, in psychology, we're basically, with Freud, we're talking about people studying sick people. This is what we have in medicine as well. We haven't studied health. And I had the great opportunity to learn. It took many years to really wake up to this, but I spoke the language fluently and I lived with the people. And probably, you know, in some ways, the biggest lesson was that I not only got to know this traditional way, but I then saw bit by bit the structures and the thoughts and the ways that this dominant system changed things. And overnight created unemployment, poverty, which had not existed, created unhappiness. In Ladakh, suicide was something that maybe happened one in a generation. And now it's one a month, and it's young people. This is black and white evidence. This system does not make us happy, and it does not make us healthy. So let's really opt for happiness. And I hope you read my book if you're interested, Ancient Futures.
Thanks. So the next question I really want to get to, because I think it's fantastic, and it also ties into some of the conversation about schooling and education that we just had. So this question is from Ali Kent. What can I do as a 10-year-old to help this movement?
What doing as a 10-year-old? Well, as a 10-year-old, you could follow in Greta's footsteps and speak out. And, you know, even for 10-year-olds, we found that our film, Ancient Futures, is quite eye-opening and, you know, would get you to think about and really stop, you know, to, in a deep way, really think about the moments when you feel happier. What is it that you really enjoy? What is it that makes you happy? And see if some of what we're talking about in the Ancient Futures film we show a bit of the traditional Ladakhi life and then the modern life. And it's been shown to children your age who have come away saying, well, I guess it's not money that makes us happy. So there's a lot that you can do too, to reflect deeply on what you feel and what you value, and then to convey that to others.
All right, Maria has had her hand raised for a little while, so I'm going to unmute you, Maria, and can go ahead and ask your question whenever you're ready. Just make sure that you're unmuted first.
Mute myself.
There we go.
Thank you. Thank you.
Where are you, Maria?
Right now, I am in St. Catharines in the region of Niagara in Ontario.
In Ontario,
I teach at the local university in the Department of History. I work as a cultural historian, and I am a Latin Americanist. The question is, I haven't read your latest book. I don't know if you make any connection between your insights and the 2030 development goals, sustainable development goals. I had my students in an Ideas and Culture course reading those goals, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, reflecting on those goals. And now I'm thinking that if I had been part of this webinar before, I would have asked them to look at the goals through the lens of localization. So the question is, do you see any merit in using those goals as a point of departure to engage people in conversation?
I see a merit in using them to critique the dominant narrative. And they're very, very useful in that way, because so many well-intentioned people are involved in formulating them. There's so much good intention, and yet overall they are ultimately supporting the dominant path. And it's a path of commercialization, urbanization, and loss of self-esteem, loss of cultural self-esteem. So it's actually a very destructive path. But you have to, again, I think the only way to address that is in the deeper, more holistic way. And it does requires a questioning of some of the deepest assumptions that keep us on that path. And it's assumptions also about, what that traditional way of life is like. And so, for instance, we found that a lot of people who were, interested in our work and interested in questioning the dominant development path became very excited about microcredit. And we were trying to explain, because we had had that extreme and rare experience of working in Ladakh and Bhutan, and then, and also in relation to other groups around the world. But so we were questioning it. And then, it wasn't that long until people were happily saying, well, microcredit, it hasn't really increased wealth in rural areas, but it has contributed to a path of urbanization. And that they would see as positive. Now, again, you can only question that urbanizing path if you also have that holistic, deeper awareness of really having an honest account of what that means. And it means, step by step, increasing the ecological footprint. So as we talk about climate change, and as we talk about a crowded planet, how on earth can we justify encouraging more people to move into the city every step of the way? Every pound of food has to be transported, usually using fossil fuel. The plastic, it's just, please, let's pause. Let's push the pause button and say, maybe, yes, as you say, through the localization lens, let's look at what we can do to support self-reliance and self-esteem. And it's quite important that we look at both the psychological pressures and the structural, because a while ago, what was brought in from the development industry was the idea of participatory development. Now, I saw very clearly how that came in after television, education had already made people feel stupid and backward, had led to people in remote areas saying, you know, we are like animals, we don't speak the language, meaning English, on the Tibetan plateau. So it is there are very few people now alive who've actually experienced the degree of psychological pressure, because they haven't experienced a culture that wasn't colonized intellectually. So now, you know, in most villages of the world, farmers are made to feel stupid and backward. You know, it's seen as primitive to have your hands dirty, and there's just huge pressure to move into the city. So really, what I'm finding is that the strong voices that are defending more localized, more nature-based, if you like, more traditional, community-based ways of living, those people are usually the ones who have had a taste of both. So for instance, you know, I recently was communicating with someone named Albert Wigan, an Aboriginal leader here, or I'm seeing it, you know, from both sides, both the more indigenous, traditional people who spent enough time in the West to have experienced the inner realities, or people like David Corton, who spent enough time outside of America to understand that this American dream was actually a nightmare for other people and for the Americans. But anyway, so yeah, a long answer. I hope to stay in touch. I hope you, I don't write enough, but my new book adds to this, but not specifically addressing the SDGs. But we can put you in touch with people who are, and yeah, please look also, I mentioned Schooling the World, look at our blogs, look at our material on our website. There's quite a lot there.
I will.
Thank
you
very much.
Thank you, Maria. I think we have time for one more question, maybe two, but definitely one.
I'll try to be short.
No worries. This one is from Galen. So he says, it's true that in many areas, farmers markets cater to wealthy consumers. Are there models, perhaps co-ops, for providing local healthy produce at more affordable prices?
Well, that's a very good question, because first of all, let's please help to get the word out that the reason why local, fresh, organic food costs more than processed, dead, toxic, chemical-intensive food from the other side of the world is because from education to school, you know, to the scientific path, to the research at university, we have collectively been subsidizing this path of global trade, specialization, technology, and energy. We've been subsidizing the creation of these giant monopolies. And that means we've been subsidizing also the infrastructure so that something can be delivered in the local economy around the world. So butter transported across the world will cost less than butter from a mile away in almost every part of the world. But again, most people don't know that. Most farmers and most economists, they still adhere to this really wrong idea of efficiencies of scale. When it comes to nature, and that means, you know, both food production, fishery farming, the efficiency of scale is the smaller the better. And the more people involved, the better. Well, you know, that might not be an absolute, but smaller the better is absolutely true. On the other hand, when it comes to industrial production, making trains or bicycles or cars or whatever we feel we need, there is an efficiency of scale. That's not going to be done, you know, at the village level. But to come back to food, please don't allow the corporate funded think tanks to keep putting out this message that local organic food is elitist. Please, let's put out the message that the toxic food and the cheap supermarkets are based on corporate welfare. And we don't want corporate welfare anymore. We want to shift those subsidies. And I believe if we had a vote, there would be virtually no sane person voting in favor of subsidizing food from the other side of the world and processed food grown with chemicals. Almost nobody. In the meanwhile, also don't fall for the trap of thinking that a co-op is always better. What we're talking about is diversity and scale as fundamental. And there, if, for me, the co-op of the future is the cooperation between producers and consumers that can happen also through a farmer's market, through a private shop, and through a co-op. But the co-op in and of itself is not necessarily a better vehicle, especially because many co-ops have become far too big. And they've basically been based on a group of producers or a group of consumers coming together to get a better deal out of the big marketplace. But by not changing the marketplace, in other words, shortening distances, which stimulate diversification, they have ended up often competing in a way that has lowered the quality. So, so in terms of some of the produce that I love, some of them consist of, in a given area, people coming together so that those who can afford to will put a bit of extra money into a pot to allow people who can't afford to buy the price, you know, at the farmer's market price or the CSA. So those are the kind of things that we can start immediately. You know, there are many people who genuinely care and like the idea of helping both the farmer and the people in the area who can't afford to pay quite as much. So those kind of local financing schemes are part of the wonderful, you know, development in the localization movement. I'll take one more if you want, but
yeah, I mean, we're at the close to the end, but let's do one more quickly. Shivam, I'm going to unmute you here. If you'd like to ask your question, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. Hi. Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm in Canada right now, and my question is that I understand what your organization wants to promote for the making of a better world globally through localization, and I agree with your ideas, and they have a strong logic. But the argument put up by a lot of people in developing and underdeveloped nations is that activists of developed nations are waking up too late when their nations have fully developed after harvesting the fruits of globalization and after becoming self-sufficient, whereas developing and underdeveloped nations have just recently begun exploiting globalization for their local national advantages in the past couple of decades. So how do you address that issue? And my second question would be, globalization has also increased global interdependency, which has probably helped nations to avoid another world war in the age of nuclear weapons. Shouldn't these issues be addressed first before going back to localization, which could promote ultranationalism as well? Thank you.
Yeah, no, very good questions. And, you know, I don't want to take too long. I hope you look at my book, Local is Our Future. And what you're talking about is also what's being taught at universities. So it's a very common assumption, and it's completely understandable. Because on the surface, yes, you can argue that in the industrialized world, you know, we benefited from the fruits of globalization, which, you know, included colonialism and, you know, raping other people's economies, you know, for our own needs. But you need to look honestly at what we're talking about, which is, as I said, even in Sweden, which did this in a relatively gentle way, it created epidemics of depression and unhappiness and suicide. How does that fit with talking about reaping the benefits? And even in Sweden, it actually was run by and for giant business. But people didn't know that. that already after the Second World War, these giants were dominating, and this cheap oil was never cheap. It was part of the whole war machine, and it's now led to a war against nature. So we're killing off species. Our health is deteriorating. And in fact, now they say, you know, the first generation probably in America who will die younger than the previous one because of this wide range of diseases. The gap between rich and poor, this time pressures, that, you know, there is so much to point to say that no, it's not been that beneficial. But that requires this deeper psychological, this deeper holistic scrutiny, moving away from the dominant narrative. In terms of avoiding another world war, as I think I said, this was the thinking as they rolled out the red carpet after the Second World War, creating the Bretton Woods institutions, the World Bank, the IMF, and the GATT. The idea was to avoid another world war. Well, in fact, world war hasn't happened, but certainly wars, plural. And don't forget, we're talking about a war against nature, and we're talking about a war basically against human well-being across the board. And now, as India and China, supposedly the latest narrative is that we have suffered from globalization. That's the narrative in the global north or in the industrialized world. The narrative is that we have suffered from globalization because a lot of our jobs shifted to China, India, Indonesia. But China and India, without a doubt, have benefited greatly from this globalization era. Again, if you look at the growth of the megalopolis cities, if you look at the students in Delhi or Beijing, where the house prices are as high as they are in London or New York, and where the job opportunities are so scarce that they are, you know, you have 10,000 people applying for a job. This is not, we're not winning. You can't win when everywhere in the world the gap between rich and poor is growing to these obscene proportions, when we're killing the natural world. So I hope you'll help to rethink and look, you know, start looking at it from that more holistic and deeper perspective. But I totally understand where you're coming from.
Oh, well, thank you for answering it. Thank you.
Thank you.
And thanks everyone for the fantastic questions. Apologies if we didn't get to yours. We're out of time now, so we're going to close the webinar soon, but I just wanted to say thank you again for being here, for participating in this conversation. And if you have lingering questions that we didn't have a chance to get to, I would definitely invite you to join the IAL, the International Alliance for Localization. You can go to our website, localfutures.org, and find the link to that. And we have an IAL listserv and Facebook group where you can post your question and get responses from other people like all of you on this webinar, and people who've been to our previous webinars and who've been involved with us over the years. So it's a great community, and I hope you'll all join it. Just also want to say that we will send out an email in the coming few days with a link to a recording of this conversation on YouTube, and I'll also send out the chat as a PDF, because there have been some great conversations and great links shared there as well.
Actually, could I also mention something, Sean?
Absolutely.
I just want to mention that over the next weeks, we will be doing quite a lot of webinars, and we're working up to a big event in June. So I hope you'll stay tuned for that. And you know, it's sort of a conference online, and it's going to be very exciting. So I hope you'll stay tuned. We haven't fixed the date yet, but we'll be bringing together many voices and hopefully, you know, help to give a boost to this whole localization movement.
And when we have the details ironed out, you will all get an email about that as well. So thank you all so much for being here, and hope to stay in touch with you all. And thank you, Helena, for being here as well.
Thank you, Sean, for dealing with all the technical side.
No problem at all.
We had in the beginning. Thank you.
All right.
Bye-bye. Thank you,
Bye.
everybody.